Okay, let's get started. So this week we're going to be hitting Chapter 3, the Introduction to TCP/IP. On the next time we meet on Wednesday, we're going to go through, I've decided after kind of looking at the test and what y'all have done, we're going to go through this video and kind of take some notes and try to wrap everything all together about what we've talked about so far. I think that'll help y'all in the long run. I do want to mention that starting next week, we will be getting into subnetting. Has anybody heard of subnetting before? A little bit, okay. So subnetting, it's really important that you know it now because it's literally going to be in every class you have from now on. It's like a fundamental networking concept, and if you get it now, you're set, right? We're going to step through it very slowly. We're going to spend 3 or 4 weeks on it. You're going to understand it backwards and forwards by the time we're done. So I'm telling you that to tell you that attendance is going to be a big deal, and paying attention and doing your assignments and stuff and keeping up with me is going to be a big deal. Because if you get behind on this, it's going to hurt you later on, okay? So we're going to wrap up on Wednesday with everything we've done, chapters 1 through 3, go through a little bit of a review, and then we're going to move on to subnetting, okay? There's going to be a lot of solving things in class, working together, handouts that I'll give out that you'll work through, so being here becomes really important, okay? So in Chapter 3, we're going to talk about a little bit about the operation of an IP network, the purpose, the operation of the protocols on the OSI and the TCP/IP or the DoD models. We have all these different models. Essentially, they all do the same thing. They might group it in a little bit different way, but the concepts are all the same. And then at the end of this, we're going to touch a little bit on IP addressing. So the text gives us like 4 pages worth of stuff that I've made an entirely different PowerPoint on. I've spread things out a little bit. When you go to do your review questions for the end of this chapter, it's going to tell you to omit some of them. That's because it's things we haven't gone over yet. And that will help you all in the long run. So let's review our OSI model. What are my layers?
Top to bottom, bottom to top.
Doesn't matter.
Physical.
Physical,
Data link.
data link, network, transport, session, presentation, and application. Okay. What kind of protocol data units do I use on the first layer? Bits. The second? Frames. Third? Fourth? Segments. What about everything else?
Session numbers.
You could have, like they call it, maybe the payload, or the data, or they might just call it a PDU, protocol data unit. It just kind of, it gets blurry up there at the top. There's not really anything specific. You'll hear it called different things. What devices are on my physical layer?
Cables, nodes.
The cables, right? The actual things the bits move on. How about my data link?
That would be your network cards.
The network cards. What kind of addressing do they understand? MAC addressing. How about my network layer?
IP address.
IP addresses. And what kind of devices?
Routers.
Routers or
Switches.
what kind of switches?
Smart switches.
Smart switches, managed switches, exactly. So that's kind of our overview of our OSI and everything that we've learned so far.
Forgotten it already.
So the DoD or the Department of Defense model, that's another terminology you might come across. You might hear it called the TCP/IP model. Again, all the concepts are the same, and things are still occurring in the same order, and we're still kind of dividing it up in a logical way that makes sense. The best way for me to remember is just by how these things are grouped when I look at the DoD Model 3112, as far as how these things coincide with the OSI model. The layers have different names, so instead of just saying, well, you know, a NIC is kind of a layer 1 thing and it's kind of a layer 2 thing because it does put the bits on the wire, but it does work in MAC addresses, so we're just going to kind of put it together as a network access and make it one layer. We've talked about once you kind of get up here in this area, you know, your PDUs, there's not really a lot of terminology. There's a lot of things happening that are all happening on the local computer or the web server, however you're getting that data down. So that line is blurred a little bit too, so they group those together in the process and application layer. So that's something you might see. The DoD model and stuff, when you get to Security Plus, you'll need to know that kind of stuff. But again, concepts are all extremely similar. They just grouped it in a way that made a little more sense to the Department of Defense. And who are we to say the Department of Defense is wrong? So this is how we, way back in the days of ARPANET, the primitive internet, this is how these things were grouped. When you put all this together with your OSI model, you end up with something that looks a little bit like this. So our functions and things like that are the same. What we're going to start talking about today is more of when you drill down into this model and look at the things that are actually happening, what do you see and what are some examples of things that use these different layers? So we know that our Ethernet that we talked about last week, which is the things that, you know, give us the pinouts that we're going to put on the cables and the kinds of cables we would use and the speeds of all those different data that flows through the cables, that's going to be more of something that would hang out on one of the lower layers. We're going to talk more about different kinds of protocols that the internet or the network layer uses that have to do with routing and finding things, assigning addresses to things so they can talk on the network. Then we're going to talk today especially about the difference between TCP and UDP. So that's transport layer stuff. We have a couple different kinds of connections we can have within an IP network. And then some of the interesting things we're going to get into today are actual processes and applications. What uses all this stuff? So what's the end result that we see through using all this different kinds of parts of these models? So one of those, which this is the old standby one, is called Telnet. So this is for emulating a terminal environment. So you know, like on the hacker movies where you see a black screen with green letters and a pointy cursor and people are typing in like crazy? That's kind of what Telnet looks like. So you're essentially consoling in to a device and then making configuration changes to it, or maybe looking into it. That's what Telnet is. Telnet is port 23. So when we talk about different things being in different ports, all these different protocols that we'll talk about, and even more after that, are going to have this specific port number assigned to them. So at any given moment, your computer or your network can have tons of different connections open or sessions open. So the ports are the way that it understands the difference between all of them. So it wouldn't make sense to have just one connection I could use all the time. So I have one connection and then lots of different ports that come off of that to keep them all separate. So the data is flowing back and forth on port 23 for Telnet stuff. For something else, it'll come in on a different port. So here's an example of the Telnet in use. Essentially, it's like you're sitting in front of the computer using it even though you're in a remote location. And a remote location just means somewhere else that's not in front of the computer. It doesn't necessarily have to be around the world or a state over or miles away. So we can configure switches this way. We can activate, deactivate ports on a managed switch this way. We can change administrative info like usernames and passwords with Telnet. Configure IP addresses, MAC address filtering, anything you could do on a managed switch, we can do through Telnet. Now we'll talk a little bit more about why that's a bad idea in a second, but here's an example of if you were to Telnet into something. what that looks like. So this uses a program called PuTTY, which is what we would use on a modern operating system, Windows 7 or something. It's a free program. Actually, they've had it for many, many Windows back. But if we wanted to console into a switch today, generally we would use something like this. So this is just an example of someone
PuTTY is quite simple. Launch PuTTY, choose Telnet. Your Telnet port of 23 has been pre-configured by the program. Enter your host name or the IP address of the device that you wish to interface with. Hit your enter key and you're in. Complete your login requirements. And in this case, I'm in one of my routers and I can do anything to this router through Telnet that I can through a console connection. And that is how simple it is to establish a Telnet connection with your device through PuTTY.
Okay, so all he had to do was have the address to get to it, and know the password to get to it, and then he could look at all the different interfaces and everything that was plugged in and how it could be configured. So for all that, that's really all you need to know about Telnet for now. Now, Telnet is not secure. So we don't really use it. We need to know about it because we need to understand what it does, and knowing what it does will help us understand other things later on. But the thing about Telnet is, it sends everything in clear text. So if we haven't talked about encryption yet, encryption is the process of basically scrambling data with this key, and you have to have the key to be able to unscramble it. Telnet doesn't do that. It just sends everything in plain text. Now, using our Wireshark, we figured out that that's pretty easy to pick up. All you have to do is have some kind of connection with a packet sniffer like Wireshark on the network, and you can find whatever passwords or anything are being transmitted if they're not encrypted. So Telnet is not used for that reason. Now that being said, send y'all. This is a website called, and you can pull this up on your individual computers if you want to and look at it. It's kind of cool. This is a map of all of the current cyber attacks that are happening in the world. Not all of them, but a good number of them. And you can kind of sit and watch it happen. Watch the attacks, where they're coming from, who they're targeting. The United States is always at the top of the list because we got so many people and we're big. Down here at the bottom, you can see all the different attacks and what's happening. You can see when, the organization, maybe the location of the attack, who the target is, and then you can see the service and the port. And as this kind of populates and you see it kind of start happening, you'll notice some of the ports that we'll talk about today down here at the bottom. And it normally takes a couple minutes to get kind of a good idea of what's happening. So in this picture, for instance, this was a very active day. I don't know, it's difficult to see, but y'all can pull up on your PDF. This was a very active day for attacks when I took the screenshot. And I know it's hard to see, but this second service down here is Telnet. So we don't use Telnet, so people try to attack it. Why do people try to attack it?
Because it's neglected?
It's because it's neglected. They figure, they probably are not going to use it. There won't be any active connections with it, so we'll try to hack into it. Now, that being said, if I want to keep that from happening, I block that port. I tell my firewall, don't accept any inbound or outbound connections for port 23, because that's the Telnet port. If I'm not going to use it, I'm going to block it. And that goes with lots of different things that we'll talk about in this class and even beyond. If there's some kind of, maybe an older technology that's not in use on your network, that's another thing. Go ahead and block it. That's a best practice. And we might, later on, scan and see what ports are open on our computers and see how we could be attacked. But especially with something like Telnet, it's unencrypted, it's not safe, you're not going to use it, block it so it can't be used. Secure Shell is on port 22, and it's a lot like Telnet, except everything is encrypted, like your username and password. And a key is provided, so your responses and stuff are scrambled, and they can't be intercepted and used against you, or maybe the password or something be used. So this is Telnet, but with encryption. FTP, something you might have used before. You may not have completely known that you were doing it, but this is receiving files from some sort of file server. This is how you would do it with FTP. So FTP will give you a directory. Here's all the files that I have inside, and then you can pick out whichever one you want and download. So it does give you access to the directories. So if you see a website that looks like this, it's just plain Jane and everything's in Times New Roman, and you can kind of search through and maybe look through, and it'll go through directories. Okay, go through here, and you can sort down into things, and then maybe right click on something and say save link as, and download a copy of it. That's what FTP does. So this website, and if you'll notice the way you get to it is just instead of typing HTTPS, like in front of the web pages we're used to seeing, now we don't even type that in anymore because the browser just understands that's probably what we mean. But back in the day, we had to type all that in. So you would just type in using FTP. Kind of get your list. Hey, here's all the files that are available. Pick which one you want and go ahead and download it. So one of the common uses of this, I know when I've used it before, way back in the day, I used to work on websites. So if I wanted to update a web page, I would download the current copy from the FTP server, make my changes to it, and then I'd re-upload it, and it would rewrite over the old version. So here's an example. This is FileZilla. This is commonly used for FTP. So here's my local site, which is, this is the stuff I have on my computer that's supposed to be up to date. And then here's the remote site. So I can literally click and drag things in whatever way I want them to be on the internet. So another use for FTP, web servers, and creating and updating websites. Because all the website is a file. I mean, it may be fancy and have animation and things like that in it, but it's really just a file, as we saw in our HTTP lab we did last week or the week before, where we just pulled up to a web server and said, hey, give me this file, and it delivered it to us in our browser. That's all it is. The unsecure version of FTP is TFTP on port 69. So the only difference here between FTP and TFTP is that it doesn't have any directory capabilities. You've got to know exactly where that file is on that web server to be able to download it. So if you're asking for a specific file, you could use TFTP to do that. It doesn't have a lot of functions, but it's good for sending and receiving files very quickly. It's quick because it's a UDP connection, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So there's no authentication. You don't have to prove who you are to be able to get to it. It's not secure, but the file has a trivial effect on the network because it doesn't have all those things in it.
That's why it's called trivial file transfer.
That's at least how I remember it, right? It's a trivial effect on the network. So, one of my favorite personal ports, because of course I have one, right, is SNMP. So, Simple Network Management Protocol collects network information, and then at some interval, maybe every 15 minutes, every 30 minutes, it polls and says, hey, what have you got going on? And then it sends back a message if there is something to send. So, for example, here we have a workstation, and we have a CPU. So here's our network management station, right? Here's our CPU. So we've got, there's a certain threshold at which a computer can get, well, it can have a certain temperature, and then when it gets too hot, it could start degrading the processor, it could start causing problems, reducing the life of the unit. Whatever that threshold is, if it goes over that, then it's going to understand, hey, my fan died, or there's a bearing going out in it, or something. It's kind of up to us to figure out what the specific issue is. But this is smart enough to say, hey, something happened to my fan. I've reached this CPU threshold, and something is broken. And then it'll send it back to the network management station, and then it's our job as a technician to go fix it. So this is essentially alerting us of a problem before it becomes a real problem. So here's an example. My business uses this. I wanted to log into the portal and show you all a bunch of cool stuff about it, but the husband was a little, don't give all my secrets away. So I'm going to show you all a little bit about what SNMP can do. So here's an example of a site. So I can set up different sites within my SNMP manager, whatever that is. There's lots of different brands that do this. And I can say, okay, I have the status of the site is up. I have this many devices in it. 7 of those devices are down. That just means they could be turned off. And there's alerts and things like that associated with this. So you can see how many servers, how many workstations are in this, how many mobile devices, and then some contact information, which is just that for my business. So if I were to drill down in this menu a little bit, I would get a list of every single thing that's on my network, whether it's up or down, all the IP addresses, who was the last person to log into it, what operating system does it have on it. All these things are coming to me because of this polling that happens. And this isn't, we're not even impressive yet. What's the amount of time that it's been up? Things like that. Or down in some cases. So if I want to, I can click on one of these devices and get even more information about it. So this is my husband's laptop. So I can see the name of his laptop, the IP addresses that it has, the operating system, the service pack, the language, who was the last person to log in. I can see details about the system, like the serial number. I can see that it's an Alienware because he's rotten. I'm just kidding. And I can see, I can put in my own inventory tags or something if I want to get more information about that. Then I can go into alerts for this laptop and see, okay, what things have happened to it. Oh, a program or feature was not compatible, and we got some kind of event that triggered on that. Well, that might be a nice thing to know, especially if it's a program that I need to run the business. It would be nice to know if they found an incompatibility with it. I can see that there was a Windows update that failed. In this spot, I could also see something like the CPU temperature went too high. I could see something really helpful like Windows tried to write to a section of the hard disk and it didn't work. What does that mean?
Well, there could be bad blocks on the hard drive.
Could be bad blocks on the hard drive. Your hard drive could be going bad. The motor could be messed up. So that's certainly something I want to know about before it breaks. Before one day someone just walks in, tries to turn on the computer, and it says, no operating system found. And then they're freaking out a little bit. So more ways that SNMP can help me. This is my favorite part. So way back in the day, if I wanted to upgrade RAM on somebody's site, so they have a new system, they have a new program that they need, and they need 4 gigs of RAM. I would have to go to each individual computer and probably, maybe, unplug it, turn it off, pull it out, look at the sticks of RAM in it, write it down, and then do that for every computer on the site, and then go back to my office and go look up all the service tag numbers and try to figure out, okay, what's the maximum it can hold, how many gigs of RAM can each slot hold, what combination do they need to buy to make all that happen. And this is a very long process, right? Well, with SNMP, it can just say, well, it's got 4 gigs. Let's do that in fancy hand.
It's got 8.
4 gigs capacity per module, so an 8 total. So I've got 2 4-gig sticks of RAM. There are 2 slots and both of them are occupied. So just with that information alone, I could figure out how to upgrade a site just off of that. And then I can see the kind of processor, the speed, the form factor, what kind of network card is in it, the drives, what kind of graphic card in it. So I get all this wealth of information about this system just from clicking and looking, instead of having to go to the site and try to figure things out, or have someone read something to me on the screen and they don't understand, and there could be problems like that. And then stuff like this is a list of all, well, several of the software applications that are installed on the laptop. So stuff like this could be helpful if 2 people are trying to access a PDF document and it looks totally different between the 2 of them. I could go back and look at this and say, oh, well, you have 2 completely different versions of Adobe installed. So let's update this one and now everything works. Just little things like that. So I tell you all this to tell you that SNMP is way cool. And as an IT professional, you'll use the heck out of it. If you don't have something like this in the future business that you have, it totally saves you a lot of time. It's not that expensive. Any questions on that? I know that's a lot of information, but that's very, very important.
What's the name of the SNMP application you used to generate that?
He doesn't want me to give the name. But there's places like Kaseya, LabTech, AVG Managed Workplace, or all these companies. They'll give you like a software package you install on the server, and then it's going to go out to all the computers that it can possibly reach and pull all this information.
Yeah, okay.
So it just depends on the company, and it may be like a couple $100 a month. So you can see how that would pay for itself rather quickly, because it's awesome.
I like free.
I know. I like free or cheap, but that makes me money, so I'm okay paying for that. all those tickets that come in, it'll automatically generate a ticket if there is a CPU threshold or something, which then triggers, hey, bring in your computer to fix it, and it makes me money, so I'm okay with that. Probably the most common port that you'll ever see is port 80. So that's just the one that websites come in through. When we did our Wireshark, we did that lab over HTTP. That's what we were using. We were using port 80. So your browser understands when you type in a web address, you're trying to go to this specific page. It's going to kind of do a little bit of translation to bring that page to you, which we'll talk about in a second. But port 80 is the one where we get all the fancy web pages from. And all those reside on the web server. NTP is Network Time Protocol. Everything you do on a computer is logged in some place, generally. So it's got a time date stamp attached to it. So that time date stamp has to stay in sync with everything else on the network. What's the problem if it doesn't?
Well, your timestamps on your files will be wrong.
Yes. If that doesn't stay in sync, basically the integrity of the data, there is an integrity to that, right? We're saying, well, on this computer it says it happened this time, this one this time, the server this time, so we really don't know when it happened, right? NTP, and I think on every computer in this whole place, when you log in, it automatically syncs up the time for you, so you're sunk up with the main servers here. So that just says, hey, I'm connected to this atomic clock, it's always right. Here's the exact time and date so that we're going to sync up when you first log on, just to make sure there's no discrepancies in our time. When you get into security stuff, you're going to see that if you have to go back and prove someone was logged in at this specific time because they did this unauthorized thing, you want that kind of stuff to work, right? Otherwise, you won't be able to prove it, and somebody might get away with something. But that's what NTP does. And NTP 119, kind of rhyming, right? That's how we can remember that. So that translation that happens on web pages, that's because of DNS. So DNS is a port 53. So this resolves a host name to an actual address. So we talked about how I can call you by your student ID number, or I can call you by your name, and both of those things identify you, but it's a whole lot easier to remember your name because you look like your name to me, right? URLs and internet addresses work in much the same way. So I can go to tstc.edu, or I can type in whatever that direct address to tstc.edu is, but what are the chances I'm going to remember that? Because it's just going to be like random IP address that may or may not change, and how would I know that, right? It really makes a lot more sense for me to just type in the words, because TSTC stands for something, quite literally, right? So DNS, what this does is if you want to go to, and this is the name of the textbook guy, so you'll see Lamley everywhere. It says, okay, I want to go to lamley.com. The DNS server goes, I don't know where that is. Let me check with somebody who's smarter than me. Then they'll go to, hey, I'm the DNS root server, I know all this stuff. And it's going to say, okay, well this address is actually this address. So lamley.com and 198.1.78.115 are the same thing. We just understand Lamley better. So it's going to come back and say, okay, well, here's the address, and it's going to remember this for later. So the next time that you want to go to this address, you don't have to go through this extra step. So it's going to say, okay, this is the address, and then the computer's going to come back and go, all right, I know how to get there now. Let me go to that web server and pick up that page, that file that is lamley.com. So lots of things happening behind the scenes when you go to a web page. That's one of the big things. The DNS is being translated, so to speak. Anybody remember Dora the Explorer? Have a little sister or a daughter? Yeah? I remember I babysat a little girl who was really big Dora the Explorer fan. So when I think of DHCP, I think of Dora the Explorer. So this is on port 67. When a computer connects to a network, it needs IP information. What happens if the computer doesn't get IP information?
You're not going to communicate, you'll get an ARPA address.
Yeah, you'll get an APIPA address. You'll get not really anywhere on the network. You probably can't get on the internet. You can't talk to anybody. It doesn't actually have an identity on the network. It doesn't understand how to talk to everybody else. So DHCP is how it gets the information to do those things. It stands for Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. Dynamic meaning changing. Your IP address can change, right? Your host is the thing that you're connecting to the internet. And then configuration protocol, right? That's how we get this information down. So the way that this happens is through a four-step process that first you have a computer coming in that doesn't have an address, so it can't talk to anybody. It's off in the corner all alone and it's sad, right? So first it sends out a broadcast. We'll talk more about broadcasts when we get to the next chapter. And it's called the DHCP Discover, hence the D in Dora. So it sends to the DHCP server, whoever that is, it goes out and finds it and says, hey, I don't have an address. Then it's going to send back and say, okay, well, I am the person that gives addresses. So how about this? Here's the things that you need to get on our network. And that's the offer. Then it's going to come back and say, hey, last time I was on your network, I used this address. Can I still use it? And that's the request. Hey, I'm requesting this specific address. So if that address is in use, can this computer use it? No, it has to be a unique address. So it's either going to come back and say, fine, here's the address, no one else is using it, or it's going to say, no, that's in use, try this one. But either way, at the end of this, after the acknowledgement, the discover, offer, request, acknowledge, the DORA, it has an IP address and now it can talk on the network. And I can tell you on my Network Plus, I had that exact question. What is the order of the DHCP process? And I remember Dora, and I got it. So if the DHCP server is down, it's not functioning, the computer can't make a connection out to it, maybe it doesn't have a network cable plugged into it. That can happen, right? You're going to get what you call a PIPA addressing. So that's automatic private IP addressing. And that just says, I'm going to give you this address and it starts with 169.254. That's how you can tell it's a PIPA. Is that right?
Who's rolling up?
Mercy, that's loud. It's going to give you this address. Now, looking at that and looking at it on your PDF that you see, what's wrong with my default gateway?
What's class B?
There's nothing there.
Oh, default
The
gateway.
default gateway. So when I get in a PIPA address, I don't have a default gateway. What does it mean to not have a default gateway?
You cannot see the router, you can't get out on the internet.
You can't get to any network besides the one you're in. The internet especially, you can't get to that. It doesn't have a default way to get outside of that network. So the PIP address gives you something to maybe look at other computers and stuff on your network, but it doesn't actually get you outside to anyone else. If the networks are subnetted, as we'll talk about next week, you can only see just the one you're in. You can't see anybody else. So that's what a PIPA looks like.
It indicates that there's a network problem between you and that router
Yes, or between
Or
you and the
switch.
DHCP server.
and the switch.
Yes. So anytime that you see an address in your IPv4 that starts with 169.254, that means it tried to go out and get an address and it couldn't, so it just gave you something. And if you look also in that field, it says DHCP enabled, no. There's another way of knowing. Okay. Enough about protocols, let's talk about TCP and UDP. So TCP is a way of moving data on an IP network that's very reliable. This is an example of what, like when we looked in Wireshark at the segment, the TCP segment, these are some of the things that we saw in it. We saw a sequence number. So that says, hey, packet 1 of 5, packet 2 of 5. That's our sequencing. That's part of TCP. We saw an acknowledgement. So when we send something with TCP, we get an acknowledgement back that it was actually received, right? So that's part of what makes it connection-oriented and what makes it very reliable. So you'll see TCP quite a bit. You'll see it in email. You'll see it in web browsing. It's taking up large blocks of data, breaking them down into segments, and then giving them to the computer in little digestible pieces, and everyone knows that everything was received and everything's fine. Now, by contrast, a UDP segment, you'll see we don't have a whole lot of the things that we had before. We're missing a whole bunch of parts to our IP packet with a UDP segment. So it's really fast. It's kind of, yeah, we'll try. It's not really acknowledged. There's no sequencing. Things might get there in order. It's kind of like if I'm speaking a sentence, but then I get the words all out of order. You might be able to figure out what I was saying, but it's going to take a little bit more effort on your part, right? So one of the reasons we talked about TFTP and it having a trivial impact on the network is because it looks more like this instead of our TCP. So it's fast, it works quickly, it's kind of a fire and forget. We're going to send out that information, but we're not really going to check up with you to make sure that anything went through. We're not going to sequence anything. So where you're going to see this is VoIP, voice over IP. So that is your voice data going over your IP network, or music streaming, YouTube, Twitch, anything, any streaming application is going to use UDP. It's going to use UDP because it's fast. And if you're streaming Spotify, as I do a lot, you might hear kind of a little robo voice happen or something, but it's going to pick right back up and keep streaming. So in that case, losing a little bit of data doesn't really hurt you. It's more important that it gets there fast than that it gets there in the perfect order and that there's acknowledgement all the time that things are happening. So that's the difference between TCP and UDP. So TCP is like a phone call, right? If I want to call someone, I pick up the phone, I dial the number, I get them on the other end, and I have this connection open between the two of us. And when I speak, they acknowledge that I've spoken. They speak to me, I acknowledge that they speak. When we get done, we terminate our session by hanging up the phone. That's what TCP is. UDP is more like, hey, I'll send a postcard to this friend. I don't really know when it's going to get there or really if it's going to get there, but I'm still sending a piece of communication. I'm just not really paying attention to how reliable it is. So you'll see TCP and UDP quite a bit. So when we go to put all this stuff together, we've talked about our different layers. We've got our transport layer. The transport layer is the part that determines if it's connection-oriented or connectionless. All these different ports that we've talked about today are things that really happen up here on the application layer, but there's kind of a division here. So POP3, used for email, is a TCP protocol because I care if the email gets there or not, right? That's important. It's important that I acknowledge that the people receive the email. Whereas TFTP, as we talked about, is a UDP protocol because it's not really as important. The sequencing and the acknowledgement is not as important. So we kind of have this division that helps us get data wherever we need it to go in the way that it needs to get there. And you can kind of see when we look back between our network layer and things like that, we've got our IP and our transport kind of smashed together. But that's how those things look kind of on a grand scheme.
So with the DNS, what's that mean? It's right there in the middle, so
It can be either.
It bridges.
Some of them can be either, depending on how you set it up. To me, DNS is kind of a big deal, right? So maybe that would be something I would set up as a TCP connection. Now, all these port numbers, you're going to have to memorize the port numbers. You're going to have them forever, right? Now, I do have a little game that we've got up that we'll play this week that will help us kind of remember them, or has in the past. But as you get to know the protocols and things like that, it'll kind of come as second nature. So here's an example of our IP header. We've talked about a lot of these things already, but this is kind of what the IP protocol has to go through every time that data needs to be sent. We have to have all of these things in place. And we've talked about a lot of these things, our source, our destination, the different protocol that's in use, the check that we're going to use to make sure that the data is correct and that something didn't get lost in transit. It's real easy for a 1 or a 0 to flip. It's just, it's one character. If something were to flip, well then our data is not correct anymore. Things like our time to live. So a packet on a network has what we call a time to live field that says, I'm going to try to route this as much as I can, but if it gets, every time it gets from one router to another, it's going to decrement that field by 1, and if that field gets to 0, it's just going to drop it. It's just going to say, instead of letting this packet float around and use up the network, I'm just going to get rid of it. If they want to send it again, they can. So all these things go into place every time we send a packet on a network. ICMP stands for Internet Control Message Protocol. Now this isn't a port number or anything, but it's something that we use a lot in networking. So what this is, if you've ever heard of ping or traceroute, those functions, what this does is it's trying to make a little tiny connection with someone else. So if I got an APIPA address, like we talked about, the 169.254, the first thing that I might want to do is, if I know the address of the DHCP server, I want to see if it's down, I'll ping it. So if you want to ping something, you go old school, and you ping command, you open up command prompt. So if I want to say ping, I'm going to make up an address. 8.8.8.8, which is the DNS for Google.
Google.
I'm gonna ping, and it's gonna say, okay, I'm pinging these addresses, and I'm getting replies every time. So here's my statistics. I sent 4 packets, none of them got lost, so that means I've got a solid connection between me and 8.8.8.8, okay? So if I wanted to ping my DHCP server, if I knew the address, and generally it's gonna be the first usable one on the network. If I've got a solid connection, well now I kind of have a little bit of troubleshooting to do. If I can ping my DHCP server, then why didn't it give me IP information like it was supposed to? So I can work with things like that. If I wanted to do a trace route for the same, a trace route goes through and says, and y'all can do this on your computers if you want to, trace RT and then a space and the address. That's going to say, it's going to show me every hop between me and the Google DNS server, which is who knows where. Dallas, San Francisco, I don't know. But it's going to show me the time that it took to get there and every address in between the way. That can be kind of fun too, just to see how many routers are between me and this thing I'm trying to get to. And you'll start to see, this will take a little bit, I'm sure. So I can see that Cogent Company, or Cogent Co. is who they use. And we're still hopping through. Now I'm 14 hops away. So ping is just my little way of making a connection between me and that address, in whichever way I want to do it. And yeah, it's still going. That's going to take a little bit.
I'm gonna try path ping.
Path ping. I never use path ping.
It's a good tool.
Yeah. Another thing to mention about a ping packet is routers ditch them. When you think about it, if I'm trying to ping something inside of my, well, they can be programmed to ditch them. Let me put it that way. So there's lots of different attacks that you can do with ping. You can like flood a network with ping responses to the point where the routers and stuff just shut down and give up. So it is common to hear of a router that when it gets a ping request and it's not internal to the network, it just drops it. ARP is a command that resolves IP addresses to MAC addresses. So we talked about the NIC, we talked about how it has a unique MAC address that's just for it. It's its own little special snowflake. We need an IP address to get to level 3, to get outside of our network, right? ARP is the command that puts those two things together. So it can say, okay, that computer with that MAC address also has this IP address right now.
So it's a data link layer.
Yes, it's resolving the differences between the data link and the network layer, exactly. This is the last bit of information we need to go over. Our IP addresses, they go from 0.0.0.0 to 255.255.255.255, right? That's the maximum. Somewhere in there is your IP address because that's all that's valid. We will get more into this when we touch chapter 3.5. But there are different classes of networks. Class A, B, C, and D. In a Class A network, the first octet, right, the number before the first period, pretend there's a dot right there. The network portion, the part that says, hey, this is the part that's on the network. And these are the part that we can put host numbers in, are distinguished. Class B, Class C, the same. Class D is multicast, which we'll talk more about next time. You might have a couple questions on this while I'm going over. And then Class E is like the research part, so that's what the universities and stuff like that will use. We can't assign it to computers, we can't assign it to web servers, we can't use it on our local computers because it's reserved for big companies, INA, people that register domain names and stuff like that to play with. It's kind of their research network. We'll talk very, very much in depth about this later on, but for right now, I just want you to check out this graphic and understand that we have different classes of networks and of network addresses, and there are differences between network and host sides. That's it. Any questions?
So when you're using these, ports in relationship to the OSI,
Mm-hmm.
is that considered to be on what?
You're gonna be in here, somewhere between, I should make that more fun. So you've got your TCP and your UDP here on your transport layer, and then your ports are gonna be in here.